You're live on Facebook. I'll click start from here and you'll begin shortly. We can start.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're safe. My name is Aya Shebi. I'm the African Union Youth Envoy, and welcome to another virtual African Union Youth consultation series on COVID-19 for a collective youth response. As part of my role to bring African youth closer to the AU, every Wednesday, same time, 2 p.m. East Africa time, I have a special guest who is a decision maker that you engage with directly and you can ask your questions live. Last week, we had the Africa CDC director who gave us some context on the state of things in Africa and Africa CDC work and leadership on the African Union and as a continental coordination institution. So he really gave us some concrete facts on this is not the first virus or emergency we're dealing with. This is as old as 1918 flu pandemic. We have also 200 viruses waiting to jump on humans, but we ended up with a generational health crisis and weak health infrastructures. And we need to also bear in mind that in Africa, there is a trend of co-infection with other diseases such as HIV and malaria. Director of Africa CDC also left us with some key messages and calls to action. See, he first called on African youth to follow the measures and work with public health experts. He also called on supporting contact tracing, and he mentioned the launch of a partnership for testing and tracing. He also called not to stigmatize and discriminate because COVID-19 is also a human rights issue. And he also called for using group accountability and building a youth-led movement against COVID-19 in Africa, and challenged us to fundraise 200 million US dollars in the next 6 months. So since Africa CDC director emphasized that COVID-19 is a human rights issue, we have this week a very special guest who leads the work of African Commission on Human and People's Rights, Dr. Salomon Derso. Thank you very much, Dr. Salomon, for joining us. And I think young people have many questions for you and looking forward to engaging with you. I'm just gonna go through the run of show. We will be together for the next hour or so. I will give first Commissioner the floor to give us a 10 minutes opening presentation or remarks, and then we'll open up for questions and engagement from you. So if you wanna ask a question, just go down to the bottom of your page where it says Q&A and click on the Ask Question tab on the top right. Since our 1,000 capacity is sold out on the webinar, we are also live on Facebook. So hello to everyone following us on Facebook, AU Youth Envoy Facebook page. Please also share with your friends who are not able to join the Zoom room. The webinar will be in English, but you can ask your questions also in Arabic and French. Le programme sera en anglais, mais vous pouvez aussi poser vos questions en français. سيكون البرنامج باللغة الإنجليزية ولكن يمكنكم طرح أسئلتكم بالعربية أيضاً. We will also be running some polls throughout the webinar, so keep an eye, and when it pops up, make sure you participate. So, Dr. Solomon, how are you?
Very fine, thank you, Aya. Thank you very much for inviting me. I am really super excited to be here with you today to discuss about one of the most important aspects of our new reality and the threat that COVID-19 poses to all of us.
Absolutely. So I'm going to give you the floor to give us an overview on COVID, youth, and human rights. But I wanted to say that we have this interesting relationship of distrust between young people and African institutions and government. So before the pandemic, young people were on the streets in different capitals challenging the status quo and protesting governance. And this has been ongoing since 2010. And now many are not collaborating or do not trust government measures or political discourse. So we ran a poll last webinar asking, are you confident the spread of coronavirus is under control in your country? 270 out of 423 said no or not sure, and only 153 said yes. So I receive a lot of messages from young people on human rights issue, on the need for universal basic income, healthcare, education, the need for protection from all forms of violence, the need for livelihoods, and for us to live with dignity as young people. But many also say that we may die of hunger and not COVID-19. And others say, it's the same for me to die in the Mediterranean or to join a violent extremist group or to die with coronavirus. I do not enjoy basic human right as a young person anyway. So it's really an important topic, as you said. So please, Dr. Solomon, talk to us more about human rights, COVID, and young people.
Thanks again, Aya. Really appreciate it. As you introduced me, I'm Solomon Ayele Derso. I'm the chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. This is African Union's premier human rights body, treaty-based human rights body. And we in the African Commission are responsible for monitoring the promotion and protection of human rights across the continent, because the African Charter on Human and People's Rights is one of the few near universally ratified instruments of the African Union. So I think from the perspective of today's focus, which is timely and extremely important, I can't emphasize enough the extreme importance of this topic, particularly for the youth. COVID-19 is certainly a threat for the life and health of all of us and the human family. But COVID-19 and the measures that are adopted to contain COVID-19 would upend our lives in a way that we have never seen before. And it has put at risk the present and future of the youth in particular, and hence the importance and imperative of the youth recognizing how serious this situation is and how they would face a very dire situation moving forward, and hence the need for their active engagement and involvement in this process. So I would like to start off with that, preliminary point. I think in terms of COVID and human rights, I would like to start off by noting that COVID-19 had highlighted that socioeconomic rights, when we talk about there are different categories of rights, what we call civil and political rights, which are the mainstay of the activity of civil society organizations, the mainstay of the activity of human rights bodies, but we also have economic, social, and cultural rights. Those are the categories of rights that are so crucial for the well-being, welfare, and indeed for the enjoyment of other rights. So COVID-19, in attacking the health of individuals, it has demonstrated how fundamental socioeconomic rights are. And the issues that you have spoken to before letting me start the presentation relate and speak directly to the question of socioeconomic rights, okay, which basically define the conditions that make it possible for individuals and communities to pursue meaningful life, to be able to have a healthy, dignified life. Those are the kinds of things that we are talking about. So in a way, it is an affirmation once again of the fundamental importance of socioeconomic rights. COVID-19 threatens and attacks the health and life of people. And what that means is basically any response to COVID-19 should make people the beginning and the end of the focus of the response. It's extremely important, in other words, that people have to be front and center of the response for containing and ending the threat that COVID-19 poses. And human and people's rights, by their very nature, are directly about the protection of people, the protection of people from various sources of threats to their lives, to their integrity, to their health, to their identity. And therefore, it's the human and people's rights norms that make it possible for the response of governments and society to focus on and make people the front and center of those responses, and hence the importance of human and people's rights. And I think I would like also to make this point that COVID-19 is obviously, by now all of us have recognized and understood, is a public health issue. But COVID-19 is not just a public health issue. And for us at the African Commission, it is also fundamentally a human and people's rights issue. The morbidity and mortality that COVID-19 causes basically is a threat to two fundamental rights recognized in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and many other international human rights. These are the right to health and the right to life. And therefore, the first, it's important to understand that it is centrally a human rights issue because of the nature of the issue, the attack, the subject that it attacks. Second, human rights also provide, as I said, an important lens earlier on, but also rich parameters, legal and policy resources that make the response to COVID more effective, legitimate, and ultimately successful. So we noted that COVID targets people, it attacks their health and ultimately their life. And therefore, human and people's rights provide us that lens to make our response people-centered. COVID-19 is also a public health emergency. And what that means is basically it puts our societies in a state of emergency, in a state of crisis. And in a time of crisis, all of us become vulnerable. And the situation of the most vulnerable among us becomes even more precarious. And this condition of vulnerability, increased, heightened state of vulnerability, means that our need and demand for human rights become even equally heightened and enhanced. It is in a time of this kind of vulnerability that we need human rights much more than in normal times, when the level of vulnerability is lower. So and hence the imperative for human and people's rights and their protection in this time more than other times. And related to the above is that with COVID having been declared as a public emergency, you can see that the various states have adopted very drastic measures. And these measures are, of course, necessary and relevant and important. And these measures have led to the mobilization of the extraordinary power of the state. So we witness, as a result of the declaration of public emergency, a state of disaster, a concentration of a huge amount of power, particularly in the hands of the executive body of government. And such concentration of the extraordinary power of the state carries huge risk, because the checks and the normal checks and balances of the state are not meant to operate ordinarily during this time. And the extraordinary nature of the power and its concentration in the hands of the executive also opens up possibilities for abuse, for this power to be used excessively. And therefore, we have a need and a demand for ensuring that we have more human rights. We have a demand and need for, at this time, for human rights more than in another time, because of this risk for abuse as a result of the concentration of huge amount of power in the hands of the state due to the declaration of state of emergency and so on and so forth. I think it's important, of course, to note at this point that the measures that are adopted, such as, for example, it could the lockdowns, the curfews, the quarantine, the testing, these are essential, and these themselves are required to fulfill and protect the right to life and the right to health. So their necessity and importance is recognized in human rights. But how these measures are implemented is also equally a very serious human rights issue. And therefore, we have to recognize that the declaration of state of emergency doesn't stop the application of human rights. It only puts limitation on certain rights, even then, with the governed by a number of fundamental principles that we have outlined in our statement, the statement that the African Commission outlined. So I think we have to recognize that. Another point that I would like to note is human rights provides us the important lens that society wouldn't otherwise have. And the lens, this is the lens for recognizing, planning for, and attending to the needs of all sections of society, particularly the needs of the most vulnerable among us. So when it is, declared that people should observe social distancing, and various other measures, such as, for example, washing hands, simple things like that one. On the face of it, these measures seem to be obvious and seem to be applicable across the board and are easy to follow for everybody. But if you apply the human rights lens, you quickly realize that not really the case. There are large number of people in the world on this continent without any access to water. There are a large number of people who live in very congested neighborhoods. And therefore, the space for observing social distancing is a luxury, is an impossibility for them. So when you apply the human rights lens, it is extremely important. The human rights lens also, particularly for COVID, is so important for another reason. That is, COVID, for us, for the measures that are being taken to succeed, these measures need to protect everybody, literally everybody. If there is one person with COVID who is not protected, then COVID would hide in that person and hits back. So we have to make sure that no discrimination happens. We have to make sure that the COVID-19 measures cover not only the mainstream society, but also those outside, including IDPs, refugees, migrants, asylum seekers. All of these need to be protected. Let me give you one example. Singapore. It is one of the countries that successfully contained COVID at early stages of of the spread of COVID, and it was touted as a success story. But there was one weakness in the approach that Singapore applied. That was forgetting and ignoring foreign migrant workers. And now Singapore is one of the countries with the highest number of COVID cases in Asia, with 11,000 plus cases. Basically, the investment that went into containing COVID in the first round went to waste because there was a category, a section of a population, migrant workers, that were not protected, that were not covered in the first instance. And hence the imperative of ensuring that migrants, refugees, asylum seekers are all covered in this process, or else COVID would have a space to hide and strike back, basically bringing to waste all our investments and efforts. So I think that is the other point that I thought is extremely important to note. The success of the measures being taken by governments do not depend on politicians. I think it's important to underscore this point. The leadership of governments and political leaders is extremely important, but the success doesn't depend on it only. The success actually depends on members of society, the people and the communities and individual citizens. Without the active participation of members of society, communities and individual citizens, any of these measures would have no chance of success. And hence another important factor why we need to have our COVID responses to be based on and within the framework of human rights, because human rights ensure that people would have buy-in. The responses that are being mobilized by government have legitimacy in the eyes of the public. And there is community engagement. For public health, without community engagement, you can forget it. All the experiences that we have in Africa, including the most recent pandemic in West Africa with Ebola, it is the community engagement and leadership that eventually overcame the threat. So I think the importance, therefore, of the involvement of the public is extremely important. I think it's important also to highlight, the number of the various rights that COVID-19 affects. I would invite the youth to look at the statement that the African Commission on Human and People's Rights issued first before this pandemic, before this disease was declared a pandemic on the 28th of February. We have issued a statement. Later on the 24th of March in particular, with detail, with 12 points, we have highlighted the kind of impact that COVID has on various human rights. I think it's important to recognize that. And we have witnessed also issues that are emerging at the moment, particularly issues relating to, for example, the point that you made at the beginning, Aya, relating to people are saying, what difference does it make if I die from COVID or if I die from hunger? It is days all the same. Absolutely. So the question always is, what are the responsibilities of states and how should the states go about delivering on that responsibility? And what also responsibilities do each and every one of us have as members of society, as organized groups, be it as civil society, as business, and as religious organizations, and so on and so forth. These are the various actors with various degrees of responsibilities, whose responsibility needs to be tapped into and mobilized in order to ensure that when we implement these measures, people do not die of hunger. They shouldn't be dying of hunger. So that is why there is a need. Human rights, there is always an inherent tension between various categories of rights. As you can see here, the right to life and the right to health, and the measures required to secure these rights may come into tension with other rights, such as the right to food, and which is extremely important and equally fundamental. Now,
absolutely,
I think
Commissioner. We have so many questions for you, so maybe we can wrap up so we can also engage with the audience.
Absolutely. Just one last point that I would like to make. The pandemic is also about the nature of our politics. The pandemic is also about our governance systems. The pandemic is also about the policy choices that we have made so far. What was the investment that we have put into our health systems? What was the investment that we have, what kind of policy choices have we made in terms of the measures that we have adopted to show that we are growing, our economies are growing? And is that reflected in the capacity of the health system that we have? Or have we made wrong policy choices? Okay, these are central policy and political questions and governance questions that COVID had highlighted. The other day, President of Ghana made a very interesting recognition that for a long time, we as Ghana didn't make the necessary investment into our health systems. And therefore, we are vulnerable during this time. And he made a promise to build more than 90 hospitals within the coming 1 year. And the point that makes is basically that there are a number of wrongs in our policy choices. There are a number of inadequacies in our policy choices. You see, for example, in South Africa, the same thing. One of the most endowed countries economically, doing very well, and government announced that it would procure 40,000 tankers. Why? Because there are vast majority of people who do not have access to water. And it's interesting, this is where I would end. Some people actually said, and this made a headline, we thank the virus for the water. That's what they said. The water should have been there before the virus. The hospitals should have been there before the virus. And health care is a fundamental human right to which every one of us are entitled, and governments are responsible for making sure that resources are made available for covering every one of us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Salomon, for that comprehensive and in-depth analysis of the situation, but also the call to action for government's responsibility, and also for young people who are engaged in human rights issues. And so we have so many questions for you, and I'm going to try to do justice to all these questions and ask them as they are. As you know, some of the questions might refer to certain countries, so I'm just going to be very do justice to this and ask them as they are. And so let's start with the first from Serge, who say, is there a special mechanism that the EU put in place to report human rights violations during lockdown? Given that from the statistics, many of us do not trust government, and is there capacity to collect and follow up? And Kiza asked in the same vein of the question, is the Human Rights Commission monitoring and receiving human rights abuses complaints during COVID-19? And if so, which kind of abuses are on the rise, and how do we deal with these complaints?
Thank you very much. These are really very excellent questions. Now, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, as I indicated at the beginning, is responsible for monitoring the human rights situation in the member states of the African Union, particularly states parties to the African Charter. And we monitor this on the basis of what we call country rapportership. So we have rapporteurs responsible for each state party to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. So, for example, me, as a member of the African Commission, I'm responsible for the human rights situation in South Africa, in South Sudan, in Kenya, Tanzania, and Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. These are the countries for which I'm responsible. So I monitor closely the events and situations of these countries. And in terms of our intervention, first, of course, we consider our role to be complementary to the role of national human rights institutions. That is extremely important. So we would like to give first the opportunity for national human rights institutions to respond. And our role is to amplify their role and to strengthen and support their contributions, including the contributions of civil society organizations, the contributions of national human rights institutions that are established through constitution, and of course, various institutions such as the judiciary that play a very important role during this time, and law societies and so on and so forth. I think that's the first one. In terms of, therefore, monitoring, we monitor through country rapporteurs as well as what we call special mechanisms. So we have, for example, a special rapporteur on the rights of women in Africa. We have a special rapporteur on freedom of expression and access to information. And some of these two, for example, are very, very important, because without access to information, you and me wouldn't know what are the things from which we should protect ourselves and what are the measures that we should adopt at an individual and community level to protect ourselves from COVID. So crucially important. So any interference with access to information by anybody would be basically, violating a very fundamental right, which is so important, particularly in this time when people should have access to these, life-saving information in a time of COVID. The same thing as far as women's rights is concerned. With the lockdown, women have to be confined in a small space for a very extended period of time, sometimes with abusive partners. And therefore, we have also this issue that we need to address and cater for, among other things, for example. So that is the mechanisms through which we are monitoring this situation. And the Commission engages with national human rights institutions, engages with civil society organizations, communicates with governments and responsible focal points of governments to ensure that the measures that we are taking are basically meant to safeguard the right to health and the right to life. They are not meant actually to trample upon other rights. They are meant to expand, to protect.
Absolutely, thank you for that. And the next question comes from two young people. The first said, I want to ask about the prisoners in our African prison. Does the Commission check on them and if they have applied social distancing or not? And I know you issued a statement on that with recommendation with governments. And then the second one, also related, Abu Bakr from Libya asked concerning the detention center in Libya, which is a long-term human rights issue for us, but with COVID-19 ended up thousands of young Africans being locked up in crowded detention center, which is increasing their vulnerability. How the AU reacted and pushed for the Libyan state towards this complex issue.
Thank you very much. Again, these specific questions highlight one important point, which relates to the sections of society that are most vulnerable and hence most at risk of being exposed to COVID-19. Prisoners and people in places of detention. For example, if you look at the statement that we issued on the 24th of March, one category of people that we have highlighted in particular are prisoners and people in centers of detention. The reason for that is that, COVID is a very infectious disease, and it is capable of spreading very widely in very congested spaces. And in many prisons across the continent, prisons and places of detention are highly congested. So one of the things that we did at the African Commission is basically to appeal to member states of the African Union, urging them as part of their precautionary measures to prevent the spread of the virus, to take, among other things, the following. First, to release prisoners and people in centers of detention who are held there for what we call minor offenses. All right? That is the first thing that we asked. We also asked member states if prisoners have to be held because of the gravity of the offense that they have committed, then it's important that they establish temporary shelters that would allow the possibility of observing the social distancing measures required to protect prisoners. The other thing that we requested member states is to ensure that contact with places of detention, places with prisons, is highly restricted and limited. And people who are actually securing these places are also regularly and daily checked and monitored so that no outbreak of COVID would happen in these spaces, because if it happens, it would have very disastrous impact. The situation in Libya, in respect of which the country rapporteur for Libya, Commissioner Hatem, issued a country-specific statement. The situation in Libya is compounded by many factors, among which is basically the ongoing conflict, which hasn't even stopped in this time of COVID. And then, of course, the very tragic, extremely saddening condition of migrants in places of detention, for whom protection has been lacking for a very long time. And in this time of COVID, our appeal and call is, of course, not just for the Libyan authorities, not just for the conflict parties, but also for various actors who are running and in control of these detention centers, to ensure that there is access to these places of centers by civil society organizations, by international humanitarian actors, so that the necessary measures for protecting these people from COVID are adequately put in place. I think we should continue to call for these measures, but in order to succeed in that, it's extremely important that we also join the call by the AU Commission Chairperson Moussa Faki and the Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, who urged all conflict parties to observe cessation of hostilities during this period. That is extremely important if the COVID containment measures are to be effectively implemented. Otherwise, our effort would be futile. Our appeal would be falling on deaf ears.
Yeah, and I recommend everyone to also read the statement. We will post it on under the link of this video. So the next question comes from South Sudan, Kakrot Wakao, who asks on the refugee communities who are facing inaccessibility of tools to fight COVID-19, how can we sustain the fight under these kind of conditions? And in that vein, we wanna have also a young refugee join us live to share his experience and also interact with you, Commissioner, directly. So do we have him ready? Okelo, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Perfect, and we can see you as well.
Thank you.
I know you have a lot to share with Commissioner Dr. Solomon, but you will have 3 minutes to really share with us the situation on the ground as you are actually in the refugee camp. Where are you right now? What's the work that you do for the vulnerable community? And also you can ask your question at the end. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chebi. Hello, everyone. My name is Okello Sejo. I live in Kakuma Refugee Camp, Kenya. And of course, the situation at the ground is not really bad, but the only problem that we have right now is the panic. Like, you know, we have people with a lot of kids. We have people with large families, but now the biggest problem they have is, of course, you know, the panic on, you know, starvation, because people are really worried. The camp is completely closed. You know, nobody comes into the camp and nobody goes outside the camp right now. And we have a lot of people who rely on, you know, small business, people who run shops, people who sell vegetables at the local market. Right now, see, everything is being closed. So the question left behind is how will they survive? Of course, they cannot rely on the food that is given to them on the food distribution center only, because the food cannot sustain them for the complete, of course, 1 month. And we also have the safety measures in place that are supposed to be followed by each and every person in order to stay safe from the COVID-19. I do a lot of writings and films as well. So I literally tell stories. I tell stories from the refugee communities. I share the voice of the voiceless. I share the stories of the vulnerable people, and I also share stories of discoveries. And of course, as youth, you know, as media youth groups, we sat down early last week and we decided to at least work together and share stories mostly on awareness and keeping the communities well informed of what exactly is happening. But we also have a couple of young refugees who are helping us doing fundraising. Maya Aluel is helping us do a fundraising in order to help the most vulnerable people in the camp. You see, if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, one of them is saying no to zero poverty, you know. But then we have people who are living below the line of poverty. So how will these people stay safe at such a situation? How will they sustain their families? See, so that's one reason we chose to go with the fundraising. We are happy to have you know, distributed couple of sanitizers, mostly to the border riders and those who sell vegetable locally. The camp is not a total lockdown, of course, but we only have curfew at night. But then the curfew are being turned as an advantage to rob a couple of people in the camp. We had a scenario where one of the refugees was buried yesterday in the morning. He was beaten partly by the policeman, you know, at his place. So he can survive. So he was buried yesterday. He died. We still have one case in Kakuma 1 as on 2, where one of the young refugees was literally beaten by the police. You know, he was admitted and he's still in the hospital right now. Nobody knows his condition. So those are some of the people. Those are some of the things people are really panicking about. Not really the COVID-19, but such issues like, you know, the violation of human rights here. To me personally, as a refugee, all rights runs on the paper. There is no human rights that is practiced. Let's say if people have to speak for themselves, you know, the need for the freedom of speech, like, you know, a free self-expression, you know, it's nowhere to be seen here. So that's one thing that people are really panicking about. But we are happy to have a couple of refugees who are producing masks for free, and they're being distributed, of course, in the community. Yesterday, we had a meeting with the Form 4 student of Kakuma Refugee Secondary School, and they are also producing soap, which are being distributed for the most vulnerable people in the community. And the last thing I do with my company, I work for Film Aid International. I'm the editor and photographer for the Refugee magazine. What we're doing is we're doing mass communication. A vehicle goes around the community twice a week, announcing each and every information, telling people what they need to do, the level of awareness, whenever there is anything, just keeping them informed. It goes around 2 days a week, all around the community, across the camp, and we share information in different languages. Some of this information is dubbed. It's been recorded as an audio, and it's being shared to different people. We have a lot of WhatsApp groups, so we send different contents to educate people and to make them stay safe. But then my biggest question today will be, if we treat refugees as people, that cannot be the problem. But the problem is treating refugees as problem is what the problem exactly is. Now my question is, what can we do in order to make sure there is equal practice of human rights for the refugees and all the communities in crisis, the same as to the citizens? Because here, literally, to be honest, I don't see any human rights being practiced. So that would be my question. Thank you, Aya.
Thank you very much, Okelo, and very, very proud of the work you're doing on the front line and on the ground. Keep it up. So you are talking to us from Kakuma refugee camp, which was established in 1992 with a population of over 60,000 since 2014. So, Dr. Solomon, your reaction.
Thank you very much, Okelo. That's really a very fantastic work. Actually, you are doing a human rights work, so essential at this point in time for your community and for the people who depend on the ingenuity of people like you, particularly in a time when, you know, communication with the wider community is extremely difficult and nearly impossible due to the measures that are imposed. So I salute you, my brother. Really wonderful job. Keep on pushing that. Now, in your presentation, I think it is a very packed, presentation that raises quite a lot of issues relating to the panic that people are, feeling, not just because of COVID, but also because of the other measures that are put in place. And, one of the most important instruments that is so crucial in a time like this one is actually freedom of association and freedom of access to information. So the work that your organization is doing in producing information and communicating that information to the community is so crucial, and highlighting once again the importance of these rights, access to information, and also association and media freedom and the press. I think in terms of human rights, particularly for refugees, COVID-19 and the measures that are adopted by COVID-19 have highlighted one thing, which is the closure would lead to the limitation of humanitarian access. It would lead to the diversion of resources that are meant to be for communities, refugee communities, like your community. They lead also to the kinds of exposure of communities like yours to abuse and violence that you have indicated. That is why for the African Commission, refugees, asylum seekers, IDPs, and migrants are a focus of particular concern. And this is because, first, as you rightly pointed out, because of your status as a refugee, there is a degree of vulnerability that you face. You do not have the same level of access to various services and resources that ordinary people do have. And therefore, that vulnerability gets even heightened during this period. But at the same time, we also say that it is imperative for states to observe the rights of this category of people, not simply because this is the right thing to do. Yes, it is the right thing to do. National human rights standards enshrined in constitutions, international human rights standards such as the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, by which countries like Kenya are bound, require them to ensure that this category of people are provided with the necessary protection. But it is also a self-interest question. If refugees are not protected then it means that you are creating a space that make your society very weak and vulnerable, not just to COVID, but also to all other kinds of situations that constitute a threat to people. So the attack on and the vulnerability of any single category of people in society basically is a source of weakness for the entire society. That is why it is imperative that the state, not just the state, however, all other sectors of society, from non-state actors, including religious institutions, civil society organizations, law societies, national human rights institutions, all of these need to mobilize the business community and individual members of society, of course, depending on their capacity, and call for the inclusion of refugees, the inclusion of migrants in these protection measures. Now, the one point that you highlighted relating to the abuse arising from the attempt of law enforcement agencies to enforce the curfew, this is one of the issues that the African Commission on Human and People's Rights is following. And it is being reported across the continent, not only in refugee camps, but also even, for example, in Nairobi. This has been reported. In countries like Nigeria, we have seen the National Human Rights Commission of Nigeria reporting that more people have died from excessive use of force by law enforcement agencies than people who died from COVID, which basically demonstrates that there are very serious issues that we need to address relating to the behavior of members of law enforcement agencies. And it is an issue of concern for us across many parts of the continent. And therefore, we have just issued a statement last week from the Commission highlighting our concern in respect, in particular, of the abuses and violations emerging from not necessarily the response measures, but how the response measures are being implemented. We are witnessing not just the shooting of people, we are witnessing the beating, we are witnessing the inhuman treatment, we are also witnessing sometimes abuses targeting women in particular. So these are definitely issues of current concern for all of us. And we applaud you and people like you who are documenting and who are also reporting on these issues, who are also providing information to the community, telling the community that if you stay outside of a certain hour beyond the curfew, you would be exposed to this kind of dangers. And it's important that you keep yourself safe.
Thank you, Dr. Solomon, and I join you in really commending the work you're doing, Okello, and thank you for joining us for these few minutes, sharing your experience with all of us here, about 500 people watching in the Zoom call and more on Facebook. So I hope your voice is heard and people have now know a little more about what's going on in Kakuma camp, but also what are the young people on the front line are doing, documenting, and doing their parts in the solution. So thank you again for joining us. I'm going to move on to a few last questions before we wrap up in the last 15 minutes. So I just want to also encourage everyone to take the polls. We've been running some polls and it's important to also make your voice heard on that. So we know we have some analysis and some data driven from you. And then just following up maybe on what you have just shared, Dr. Solomon, around brutality and violations. Daniel was saying that we've noticed recent trends in rising of human rights violations ranging from police brutality in Kenya during the containment of curfew to arbitrary arrest in Uganda to the alienation of citizens perceived in opposition in Togo and many other cases. And he was particularly asking on what the AU is doing about it at the policy level to address these concerned governments. And in the same vein, Samson from Ethiopia was asking, how is the Commission responding to the violations of rights of young Africans living in China? What steps have the Commission taken to bring justice and repatriate these Africans who are suffering on the other side. And I'll just combine these two with another question which was asked in French by Hamid Suleiman. He said a few weeks ago, according to some information, there was a temptation of testing vaccine on Africans. Is there any verified information on this? And also, what is the position of the EU on the WHO response to the remedy discovered in Madagascar? So I think these are all questions who speak, one, to the human rights violation and the different countries that were mentioned, but also the young people or the Africans in general who are outside of Africa and who might also have been subjected to human rights violation. And then I think the third aspect of it is on the vaccine, which is also protecting in an ethical way, conducting these trials for vaccine, and what's the position of the EU, even the response of the EU to WHO response to Madagascar. So just to sum it up, but you can pick on what you think is important first and address it. Thank you.
Thank you very much again for these very important questions. I think, as far as police brutality is concerned, one of the things that we at the level of the African Commission are doing is basically to support the work of, as I say, national human rights institutions. Some of the national amplifying their work, and in amplifying their work, urging member states to ensure that they adhere to certain minimum standards that need to be followed. And this has obviously need to be, to be provided and to be controlled by everybody. So various national human rights institutions, civil society organizations, law societies, and the courts. I think during this period, as I said, because of the vulnerability of people, because of the heavy concentration of power by the state in mobilizing its extraordinary authority during emergency, there is a higher risk for violations. And we are not surprised as a result that we are witnessing these incidents of violations, which we deeply regret and which we condemn. These shouldn't happen. And for us, actually, these are not really the ways by which these measures can legally be enforced. Okay, these acts of violations are themselves violations of law, violations of human rights standards by which states are bound. So we urge and call on national human rights institutions, civil society, members of the media, very, very important, the judiciary, to ensure that they actually elevate their monitoring capacity, their response capacity. So we are witnessing, for example, some of these things. I applaud, for example, the decision of the High Court of Kenya, where the courts basically, after receiving an application from the Law Society of Kenya, said that the police was in violation of applicable standards in the Constitution and in international human rights standards, such as the standard by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And that is the kind of engagement that we are applauding and enforcing. We are also, of course, using the different means available to us, including, for example, at the moment, we are preparing to engage the wider African Union in the light of all these issues that are highlighted in our conversation today, to ensure that human rights become one of the pillars of the continental response for containing and ending COVID on the African continent. So that is really the kind of engagement that we have at the moment. I think it's extremely important that, in a time of crisis, one of the challenges that we see is not just the emergence of tendencies of violations from members of law enforcement agencies. We also see, bigotry becoming so visible on the part of societies as well. All right. So the events that we have witnessed in terms of the attacks against African nationals in China, extremely condemnable, and we basically, as the African Commission, our jurisdiction is limited to the African continent, and therefore we don't have any legal basis to engage with the authorities in China. But to the extent that this concerns the rights of Africans, we obviously reiterate and call on all countries hosting African nationals to ensure that Africans are treated with dignity. And in this context, our call is also to the African Union and member states of the African Union to engage the Chinese authorities to ensure that Africans are not singled out for attacks and for discrimination because of their identity. And this is actually contrary to everything that the emergence of COVID-19 have showed us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salomon. And the chairperson of the African Union Commission did react immediately to what's happening in China. And the Commission contacted the ambassador here in Addis, and action has been taken, with Foreign Ministry there. And I think we are on a good track with assure the audience, because there were many questions on young people in China, but in other countries. And for sure, the Commission is standing for the protection of Africans outside of Africa. So as we wrap up, I have one maybe last question, which really encompasses maybe the rest of the vulnerable communities, basically. So we have a question on how do we protect people with disabilities in this time. Another from Fatou from Senegal: what strategy to ensure we're giving care to the rights of people in terms of sexual reproductive rights. Another one from Dixon on Article 30 of the Charter says that we need to protect people's rights, but what about people in rural communities? Do they have access? So I think it's just a list of questions on the different people who are really left behind, basically, in this pandemic response due to our weak infrastructures, but also during this time, how do we respond and really put them center to the attention of the strategy and the funds that have been put in place by so many of our member states, but also by the AU. We put in place in Africa COVID-19 response, which also shows the solidarity and leadership of Africa. But then the question remains, how do we ensure the rights of all these people, sexual reproductive health rights, people with disability, rural communities, street children, to ensure that we give them the attention they need and we give them the support and assistance that they also need?
Great question again. You are absolutely right. One of the things I have highlighted this point, but I would like to repeat it, which is a pandemic like COVID-19 wouldn't be defeated through the action only of government. It's extremely important, therefore, that community members are at the center, not just of being on the receiving end in terms of what needs to happen, but also in terms of how to be agents of the protection, the process of the protection, the process of the containment. Okay, their role becomes extremely important. So the role of human rights in this context would be, when you design the responses, it's extremely important that you take into account the needs of persons with disabilities. And the only way that you take into account the needs of persons with disabilities is if persons with disabilities are consulted and they put also forward their ideas on how they could be catered for, their needs can be addressed. I think that's extremely important. The same thing for other sectors of people. So what we say is basically it's extremely important that it is, a community-centered, it is a people-driven process that we need to have in place. Without that, our efforts, which is, hanging only on the role of government, wouldn't be successful. That is why you need to identify what are the kinds of needs that various categories of people have, and what do they say that they need in terms of the kinds of protection measures that need to be put in place in order to cater for their needs. Based on listening that, then you can design measures that are inclusive, all inclusive, that cater for the interests and needs of this special category of people as well. Basically, when we say special category, it's not in the sense that they have additional, more privileged rights and so on and so forth. Not really. It's about making sure that the rights that are accessible to ordinary people, to each and every one of us, is actually accessible to them as well because of their condition. So their voice is central, and we have to listen to them. And that is the only way that we can protect everybody from COVID.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salomon. This has been a great session with you. And I want to conclude from your words in 1 minute with a call to action and a commitment from you and the Commission to young people who've been watching us throughout this hour. More than 500 have been watching us here on Zoom and more on Facebook Live. So one commitment and one action.
The commitment that I call upon my brothers and these sisters, the African youth, is this one, which is basically COVID has demonstrated that human rights are of paramount importance to the lives and well-being of everybody. And human rights are not a luxury, they are a necessity. And therefore, you should be the agent, not only to seek protection from violence, but also to provide protection for others. And in this time of COVID in particular, it is a time that challenges all of us. And the challenge for you is, how do you not only comply with the science-based advice and measures, but also help others to comply with these measures, mobilize and organize in order to ensure that you are protected, others are protected in compliance with the human rights standards. So the commitment for you is you bear responsibility to protect yourself first and foremost, and then contribute for the protection of others. That is the commitment that we expect of you. And look out for those sectors of society who, on account of their specific conditions, couldn't be able to protect themselves, couldn't be able to provide for themselves in this time of need, and mobilize for meeting their needs and demands.
Thank
From
you.
my side, as the African Commission, as the chair of the African Commission, I commit myself, and indeed the African Commission, to keep our door open to receive and entertain the questions that you may have, the appeals that you may have, and we will continue to monitor and respond to the various human rights issues that you have raised, but also those that would be emerging. I think the most important thing for us really is that things wouldn't continue as before once we have conquered COVID. It is extremely important that the equality of everybody, particularly in terms of access to socioeconomic rights, is realized, and indeed the future, the present and future of the youth is not endangered because of not just COVID, but also the various disruptive measures that have been adopted, not just in Africa, but also outside of the continent globally. The dire socioeconomic forecast that we are witnessing, that puts your present and future in danger. And it's extremely important that you think outside of the box and you fight, not just for securing the little that you have, but also for creating even more.
Thank you very much. This is an inspiring way to close the webinar. We come to the end of our webinar today. I had the honor to have our special guest, the chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, who has responded to your challenging questions. And I hope that we did justice in facilitating this important conversation. I see a lot of you on the chat exchanging contacts and calling to action. So please keep this conversation going. This is just a platform for you to join hands. And as the commissioner called for all of us to really join hands in this fight, because it's our fight, all of us. I think that African youth rights should be protected and respected. We all agree as an outcome of this webinar that the most vulnerable should live with dignity, because our generation deserves to live with dignity on our continent, because we're the most interconnected and most innovative, the coolest generation of all times. But we need to support our peers and make sure we hold our governments accountable with the instruments that we already have in our hands, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, but also the African Youth Charter, which, funny enough, both of them were adopted in Banjul, the Gambia. So I encourage all of you to check these documents out and use them as your instrument and tools for advocacy and accountability. My fellows and comrades, as I always say, know that you're not alone. We are in this together. Let's organize, unite, and play our parts to co-lead the solutions. We are the ones to save our continents. And once this webinar will end, you will have on the screen a survey that will be displayed, and I encourage many of you to take that survey and share it with your peers, so we can continue to collect youth-led, Africa-led driven data. Thank you for joining us and see you next Wednesday. Merci et à mercredi prochain. شكرا لانضمامكم وانتظركم الأربعاء المقبل. سلام.
Thanks a lot.